So like I said, Dr. Joyner's theory doesn't address ideation to action, and that's where the researchers are now. Right now, the three-step theory is becoming evolved. They're working on it, and they're trying to get there. So with the three-step theory, again, it's rules of threes that we like. The first piece is, are you in pain and are you hopeless? Pain and hopelessness is what leads to suicidal ideation. However, what they found is the ideation doesn't become strong enough to move to action without pain exceeding connectedness. So again, the variable connectedness is huge. It's critical. So if connectedness exceeds your pain, that leads to the strong ideation, and then again having the capacity. So they're trying to find what link moves from ideation to action, but again, it's just not there yet. But if you're interested in this stuff, if you go find the three-step theory of suicide, they wrote a really fantastic, like 20-page article, and it really resonated, a lot of information, and it was fantastic. So let me ask you this one, myth or fact? So most people fact?
Yeah.
I don't think the risk is.
Does anybody know of any data that supports this? No. That's the problem. I think, we're going around calling ourselves victims. If a first responder dies by suicide, what is generally posted on Facebook for the reason for it? PTSD and trauma. Do you guys believe that PTSD and trauma are what's killing our first responders? No. You guys are awesome. Exactly, not all of them. PTSD is real. PTSD is a real disorder. But to say that 37% of first responders have PTSD, it's completely wrong. I remember reading that study that came out. There was a study that came out and it did a meta-analysis of all research for first responders, and it said 6 to 37% of first responders have PTSD. But it gave that range because they didn't know. And one of the biggest reasons they didn't know is because they did not have any structured clinician interviews. So without a structured clinician interview, you can't be diagnosed with PTSD. What they found is self-report. A lot of people self-reported that they had PTSD. In fact, military found that self-report gave a 50% higher rate of PTSD for the military than actual PTSD. Unfortunately, people think that having nightmares equals PTSD, having flashbacks, having odors. But to be diagnosed with PTSD, you have to meet 4 clusters. And your day-to-day activities have to be significantly impaired. So diagnostic criteria for PTSD is really rigid and stringent. The unfortunate sad thing is there are other things that we suffer from because of the job or because of our lives that do impact us, but those things aren't acceptable. They're stigmatized still. It's okay to say PTSD now, but it's not okay to say depression, grief, and whatnot. So hopefully we can change that. So really, we don't do anybody justice if we call ourselves victims and we blame the job for the suicides, because we're not finding the root cause, right? And I stole the Facts Not Fear from James Johnson. He teaches a class on Facts Not Fear. And I think we have an issue of turning everything into an epidemic. I hear it. Have you guys heard that there's an epidemic of suicides in the fire service or in the law enforcement? Do you guys think that it's an epidemic?
It's always been there.
Thank you. It's always been there. Dr. Sabia's research was 1984 to 1999. That's where the 3 to 1 came from. It's always been there. It's not an epidemic. We're talking about it more. We're sharing it more, but it's not an epidemic. So to add to that, I know this is hard to see, so I'll describe it for you. But the CDC, hold on, before I get there, let me ask you this real quick. If I were to say nurses were at increased risk to breast cancer than the general population, would you guys agree to that?
Yes.
Being a nurse puts you at increased risk for breast cancer?
Because they're female.
So it's not being a nurse, it's the individual factor, and that 90% of nurses are females. Okay. So now that we know that, we can look at women and then find out what's going on. So same thing for first responders on two pieces. First of all, we have to look at individual factors, not blanket, vague identifiers, but individual factors. So what are first responders primarily comprised of? White males. And we can look around this room and see that. It's primarily white males. I know for the fire service, 82% are white males. So that too is the population that is more likely to die by suicide. And so on the right side is the dark blue. On the left side is the light blue. Dark blue is male. And you can see at the top, white males, their suicide rate's 26 per 100,000. Black male, it's 10 per 100,000. Black female, 2 per 100,000. And white female, 7 per 100,000. So white males are almost twice as likely to die by suicide than the general population, because that was 14 per 100,000. And then also, this one shows what happens as you age. So if you see males, as they age, suicide rate goes up. If you are a white male that's 25 to 34, suicide rate's 26. By the time you get to 55, it goes up to 28.8, and then over 65, 32. So as white men age, suicide rates increase. For women, it peaks at 10 at age 45, and then it goes back down. And there's suggestions for why this is the case. No concrete evidence, but there are suggestions. And when we think about connectedness, I think it makes sense. As white men age, what happens to their social circles?
They get smaller.
They get smaller. If you respond to calls on the weekends, especially at churches, what's the one population you don't see a big group of hanging out together? Yeah, white males. Hispanics, very large gatherings. Blacks, very large gatherings. I know on Friday, the Muslims, we all get together. So it's a lot of family. And if you are Palestinian, you are somehow my cousin, even if you're not. Like that's how it works. Like very, very big, like we're all somehow related. And I see that with most other cultures, but you don't really see that with white, and specifically white men. As they age, their circles decrease. As white women age, they hold on to a few really good friends. They play bridge and do, I don't know, I'm not there yet. I don't know what I will do as I age, we'll see. So the IAFF, they are going to work to try to help us with our data, because one of the reasons we don't know is because there's no data that is 100%. You know, the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance, they collect statistics on suicides, but it's all voluntary reporting. And then on top of that, they just have the number of firefighters that die by suicide, but they don't know out of how many. So they can't say 18 per 100,000 because they don't have the numerator and the denominator. They don't have that. So the IAFF, that's one of their big projects that they're going to start, is they're actually going to start tracking suicides. So they've asked that starting now, if you know of any suicides for an IAFF member, because that's all that they have all the full information on, report it to them. And soon, I believe, I don't know if you'll talk about it, but soon they'll have the whole tracking mechanisms. And then maybe from there, we'll start to see trends and rates, and we'll be able to make better assumptions. So with that, and with me bringing up the nurses, we have to look at individual factors. And we have to address those individual factors to make a difference, right? So we do know that there are occupational considerations that can make us more susceptible to suicide. After learning about Dr. Joyner's theory and the acquired ability, we know that we are self-sacrificial, right? If we get on scene at 2 a.m. of a house fire and it looks pretty scary, but you hear that there's 2 kids in there, we're gonna try to go save them, right? If you're a police officer and you're trying to save somebody, you're gonna put yourself in danger to help somebody else, something that you wouldn't, a human naturally wouldn't do, but you'll do. So we do those things, and that helps us overcome that instinct to survive. What about this one? Socially prescribed perfectionism. I could say it another way. This is the way Bobby Halton says it. Zero defect mentality. Do we have that in public safety? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have don't let anybody see that you have a mistake or that you're not perfect. And it's a big problem. It's a huge problem, because that socially prescribed perfectionism is what leads to feelings of failure, which what leads to feelings of shame. And shame is the common denominator behind addiction, mental health disorders, depression, and suicide. It's shame. And what shame is it's not the same as guilt or humiliation. Shame is, I am wrong. I am damaged. Whereas guilt, humiliation, those are, oh, I did something wrong, I made a mistake. But we have this socially prescribed perfectionism where it's very easy to find yourself in shame and become humiliated and isolated and all that other stuff. And then I talked about the experiences that lower our fear of death. How many people here get 8 hours of sleep every night? I know, no, yeah. So I was lucky and I got to sit on a subject matter expert committee at the NFA. It was very low bid, that's why I was there. And it was about mental and physical health. And it was neat because we had some psychologists there and we had some really knowledgeable people. And when we talked about what's the one thing that we could fix that could save firefighters' lives, it was sleep. Sleep is a common denominator. That's going to be the last time I say that. I've said that a lot already. With metabolic disorders, which can lead to the cardiovascular disease, it's been found to be a probable carcinogen because when you sleep, your body releases toxins. That's the purpose of sleep, to release those toxins. And then sleep is the only place that your mind fully processes the events of the day. During REM sleep is when you process traumatic events and events that, remember our brain when the lid blew off? During REM sleep is when it processes it and the limbic and the prefrontal cortex communicate again and figure out what was going on and then store it. So if you're not getting into REM sleep and you're not getting good sleep, you're not processing events. You're going to be more susceptible to depression. You're going to be more susceptible to PTSD, cognitive disorders, dementia, and all that stuff. So sleep is so important, especially the REM sleep. That's your second stage. So as you sleep, you start in that first stage. In the first stage, your body recovers. You get into the deeper sleep, your mind recovers, and it goes back and forth. That's why if you get a call in the middle of the night, you either wake up and you're like alert. That meant you're probably in first stage. If you wake up and you like walk into a wall and you're totally confused, you were in the REM. That REM sleep is so important. I know I used to hear Ambien being advertised for first responders, shift work disorder. Ambien will actually damage you more than it will help you because it prevents you from getting to REM. It puts you in first stage and leaves you there. You've got to get to REM for your mind to recover. I know we also like to use alcohol to help us sleep because we found that works. It's the same thing as Ambien. It puts you in first stage. So I know we can't do anything about calls at night, but we can do small things to help with our sleep hygiene. Naps. Naps should be allowed at busy companies. You should be allowed to get at least 90-minute nap. That's important because that gets you through the first REM stage. It gets you through it and out of it. Anything longer than that, no good. If it's less than that, it's got to be less than 30 minutes. So naps are really important. Having cubes that are divided so you don't hear somebody snoring, so you actually sleep, very important. If you have two companies at one station, only waking the company getting that call, very important. In those separated cubes, removing TVs, removing anything that gives you something to do. Your bed should only be for sleep because your body is smart. When it recognizes the bed is a place to play on your phone and watch TV, it doesn't recognize it as a place for sleep and it's harder to fall asleep. So there are small things we can do for sleep hygiene to help us, but we're unwilling to do those things, basically, I believe. It took me a while. I used to watch Netflix every night before sleep, and it took me forever to break that habit. I bought a Kindle, an e-reader, and it's the greatest thing I've ever done because it doesn't have blue light, and I read about 20 minutes and I'm out. One of the greatest things I ever did. And then temperature. 66 degrees is optimal sleep temperature. But it's just little things we can do to improve our sleep hygiene. Do you guys all know that you can turn off the blue light on your phones? Yeah. It's super easy if you don't. Like the iPhone is so smart. I just say, hey Siri, turn on night shift.
Night shift is now on.
And it's on. You can also set it for every night at 7 o'clock, it automatically turns on. And I know that Android phones, they do that too. But when you turn on night shift, it turns off the blue light. Blue light is what causes the melatonin not to release. So you want to rid yourself of blue light before you go to bed. Somebody with poor sleep they found there's a direct link between poor sleep and depression. Poor sleep and major depressive disorder, there's a direct link. They found that somebody with major depressive disorder is 20 times more likely to die by suicide than somebody without it. So just think about that. If we are trying to prevent suicide, we have to address these individual factors, and sleep is huge. It might mean getting off work and taking a nap if you're on a busy company. And I know we have such a macho attitude. I know, like, if the guys at the end of the day, they're like, hey, what are you doing today? If I admit that I'm going to take a nap, I'll be made fun of, so I don't. But I generally schedule a nap after work. So if you're able to do that, I highly recommend it. It will save your mind, and it'll add years to your life. We talked about that. So there are common mental health problems found among emergency responders. So we talked about the general population, 50% rate of mental health disorders. Because of our career, we are susceptible to certain ones that can make our rates even higher. Depression is one that's been found to be extremely common. There's an article I just read from Fire Engineering, and it was fantastic, and it explained how poor sleep affects the gut, it affects the serotonin receptors, and when the serotonin receptors are affected, they're the ones that are the feel-good hormones. When they're affected, that's what can lead to depression. Substance abuse, not like illegal street drugs, but how many people here have ever been injured and been prescribed a painkiller? A lot of us. Because our job, we are prone to being injured. And unfortunately, some people become addicted to those substances. Some people try to get back to work too soon, so they mask their injury, they don't actually fix it, and they try to get back to work too soon and they become addicted. Also, we're not good about talking about things, so it's easier to abuse certain substances like alcohol to kind of mask any kind of stress. Anxiety has been common, sleep disturbance, I talked about that. Post-traumatic stress, of course, because we do see trauma. But just remember, post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder are two very different things. And post-traumatic stress is extremely common. It's extremely normal. Our bodies are so smart. When our bodies exhibit signs of post-traumatic stress, that's our body protecting us. Hypervigilance is a means to protect you. Nightmares, believe it or not, dreams, like I said, that's where you complete and that's where you process events. So in those nightmares, your body's actually trying to process that event. So for people who don't understand or who don't believe that brain disorders are just like any other organ in the body, they are. And you'll see, depressed brain looks very different than a normal brain. You'll see somebody who has an addiction, their brain looks very different than a normal brain. So these things are not things that people can just snap out of or things that will just get better if you exercise. Sometimes these things they require actual clinical assistance. They require actual therapies to help people heal, and they are real. So you guys are good. I think you guys already mentioned this, and I appreciate it. So Chief DeGrice shared his data from the Chicago Fire Department. In 15 years, they had 3,000 contacts, and the number one issue that they dealt with were relationship problems. And that's common with the general population. Somebody who's dealing with a divorce, suicide rate goes up to 34 per 100,000. So if you understand Dr. Joyner's theory, the lack of connection, the lack of purpose, you can see how a divorce can take those two key components away from you. Work-related problems are the key contributor to suicide and PTSD. And it's not the cause we go to, it's organizational problems. It's leadership. It's no support. The number one thing that can prevent PTSD is support from your supervisor. That's the number one thing that can prevent PTSD. And then alcohol, legal, drugs, and PTSD finally at the bottom. So again, like I said, I don't spend a lot of time on risk factors and warning signs because most people with a documented risk factor will never display the outcome. But we'll talk about a few of the ones that are more common. So distal risk factors, these are things that are unchanging. They're things that we can't change, they're long-standing, inherent. So we talked about trauma, you guys understand that, how trauma can be a risk factor. Early lifehood adversity, huge when your mind is developing, any sort of adversity, and now we understand why white males have that risk factor. And maybe it has to do with the socially prescribed perfectionism with the white males as well. So proximal warning signs, these are some things just to listen out for or clue in. Major loss is a major piece of it, major loss. And then talk of feeling trapped, being a burden, or feeling hopeless. When you hear people talk like that, those are people that you want to check in on. Those are people you want to make sure aren't isolating. And again, remember my friend Brian, he called and I blew him off multiple times. And then finally, I broke down. Sometimes you have to be persistent with people. So we all know, we all like to be alone when we're under stress. And if somebody forces you to be in the group, it doesn't work. But persistence is key, because you will get to that point where you hope that people haven't given up on you. So this is a very busy slide, and this came from the QPR Institute, but it does a great job of explaining that it's never one cause. So Dr. Quinnett created this. This is the paths to suicide. And under the underlying risks, it's everything from biological, personal, and environmental. So they are finding there is a genetic link to suicide. If your father died by suicide, you're more likely to die by suicide. They did twin studies, and they found that. They found with those twin studies that, not just genetic, but mental health disorders in that piece. The personal problems, a loss of a parent, culture shock, and then values and religion. We all know that if you have a strong belief in religion, that can be a protective factor. It doesn't mean that people who don't have a strong belief in religion are wrong. It just means they're different and raised different. And I can relate. Being a Muslim in the South, I remember in the 5th grade, I had somebody come up to me and say, if I don't turn my life over to Jesus, I'm going straight to hell. And I was like, but my mom says I have to be a Muslim or I'm going to hell. And I was so confused. I was so confused. So just remember, it's not as easy for everybody to have the same values. And for me, one of the greatest things that's happened for me is not somebody forcing me to do something or telling me that I'm going to hell if I don't do it. It's somebody loving me and including me unconditionally that's drawn me to my beliefs. So this is to say that there's no way that you guys are going to memorize everything on the left. You're not going to memorize the risk factors. You're not. So let's just focus on the protective factors. Those are going to be a lot easier, and that's what I'll finish this part of it up with, is protective factors. The way I view it is it's like a scale. As long as the protective factors can outweigh the risk factors, we can keep somebody, hopefully, towards life. And from what I've said so far today, what do you guys believe is the strongest protective factor? I heard it. Inclusion, connection. Strongest protective factor is connection. And that's why on the scale, it's the biggest one. Ooh, I forgot to delete. My computer crashed at FDIC. That's why this still has some FDIC on it. Sorry. Do not pour water on a MacBook. It will die. You will have to buy a new one. Anybody here practice mindfulness? Awesome. A lot of the clinicians raise their hands because they get it. Mindfulness is a superpower. Mindfulness will protect you from PTSD, depression, anxiety, and suicide. Asheville Fire Department, they are now doing the 8-week mindfulness-based resilience class in their academies, because you can't go and spend 4 hours talking about it and expect it to happen. You actually have to teach your people coping skills. That's what we lack in public safety. We are not taught coping skills. I know we're wanting to have these awareness classes, but unfortunately, until we can help people learn about coping skills, it's not going to do any good. I hate to say it, but we know it. We all know what's the #1 killer of line of duty deaths? Heart disease. And we get those classes all the time. Do you see everybody exercising and eating healthy? You get made fun of it if you try to make kale at the firehouse, So we know that education isn't enough. Instituting mindfulness-based resilience will save your people's lives. And it's not hard. It's not hard at all. So I believe in the next 20 years, we're going to see that happening. The sooner you do it, the sooner you'll be protecting your people and you'll be cutting edge. We all know we're busy, and it's like, I don't have 5 minutes to meditate. That's like a waste of time. I promise if you start it and you practice it, you will feel so much better, and you actually feel empowered to have more time in your day. There's 2 apps that will help you. One's called Headspace. That's the one that I use that basically walks you through a day-by-day meditation routine. And then the other one's called Calm. But meditation is just, it's not hard. It's very easy. You sit still and you focus on your body. Breathing is the easiest thing to do, so just count your breaths. while you're doing it, thoughts will come to mind, like I have to drive to Roanoke, I have to do this, I have to do this, I got to be here, I have this presentation. Thoughts come to mind. And what you do is you accept that thought and you push it out and you go back to your focusing on your breathing. And through doing that, you learn how to push away thoughts. You learn how to push away judgments. You learn to be more in control of your thoughts. And they found that it actually changes your neuroplasticity, which these are things that we don't understand, but negative thoughts become automatic. And they become out of our control. That's why the depression cycle is a cycle. You can feel so much better, and then one setback brings you right back there. Same thing with suicide. It's a cycle, and we have absolutely no control over those negative thoughts. But through learning things like mindfulness, we learn to be stronger than those thoughts. So prevention strategies, y'all nailed it. Positive social support, occupational post-trauma support. We're doing a really good job of that, and we're learning that it's never forced. It has to be the person's choice. Biggest things that we can do, and what you guys are doing today, and the fact that you guys are here is amazing, is destigmatizing help-seeking behavior. Remember, most people with a documented risk factor will never attempt. So instead of looking for people at risk, we have to create an environment to where those people are willing to talk and ask for help. And then company officer training is strong. After hearing my story, you understand why I'm like dead set on that one. But we have to protect our people, and our company officers are that first line of defense. So there are evidence-based treatments that will protect people and prevent people from dying by suicide. So somebody who is depressed and suicidal and they're thinking about it all the time, if they're willing to go to therapy and receive these treatments, it will help change their way of thinking. The best one that they found so far is dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a spinoff of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very common behavioral therapy where you learn how your thoughts and your behaviors and your feelings all kind of drive each other, and you learn how to kind of just change the way you perceive things to where you're not having negative feelings. But with dialectical behavioral therapy, that one helps you to be more accepting of yourself and of why you think a certain way, but also to help you to change for a more positive way of thinking. The ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, that is always the last one that's used. It's always waited to the end. It's always, if nothing else worked, they go to that. But what they found is that is the best one. They found there's no negative adverse risk. I think it's just because the thought of electric is scary, but they found that one is absolutely the best. The greatest rates of remission, decreased depressiveness and whatnot. So I think as time goes by, we'll see that being used a lot more often. But there is no gold standard yet. Again, remember, just 10 years ago, funding for suicide prevention was at an all-time low. So it takes time for science to find out what works and what doesn't work. Now this is interesting, the belongingness intervention. Has anybody ever heard of that? So one thing, and I made somebody mad, and it's scary to say things when you're getting recorded on YouTube, but I posted something on Facebook the other day that I read, and basically what they found is no efficacy has been found with hospitalization of suicidal people. Zero efficacy. They even found 3 months after hospitalization, rates of suicide were pretty high for those people. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be hospitalizing people, right? Because if somebody is suicidal and they are taking steps to enact their plan, something has to be done. But what's interesting, even though they found no efficacy there, they found that through connection, that reduces suicide. So after people were discharged from the, like their 72-hour hold and they didn't want any more help, the hospital sent cards, personalized cards to half the group. And then the other half of the group didn't get any cards. The group that got personalized cards had substantially lower rates of suicide. So then Australia did a similar study, and they didn't even make it as personalized as the first, but they did a similar study where they just sent cards, hey, you know, we care, we're here for you if you need anything. And again, they found the same thing. The people who got the personalized card or expression that somebody cares about them were less likely to die by suicide. So everything that I've read and learned, the saddest piece of it all is the things that work the most are so simple. Just reaching out and caring with other people and connecting with people can be life-sustaining. And that's the saddest thing is we can't always be there. We're not always in the right place at the right time. Have you guys heard of Kevin Hines, the kid who jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge and survived? He's got a very powerful story. He jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge, and right before jumping, he had planned it all day. And in the 2 hours before jumping, he had a sudden change of heart. He did not want to die by suicide. He wanted nothing more than to be saved. And he walked up and down the bridge twice, walked by 2 police officers, hoping somebody would say, hey, are you okay? Well, finally, somebody asked him to take their picture. And in that moment, he realized just nobody cares. Absolutely nobody cares. And he jumped. Immediately after jumping, he said in that first second, it was immediate regret. And he wanted nothing but to survive. And he thinks that that may have been what kept him from dying, because he shifted his body to where he landed feet first. And then there was another individual who wrote a suicide note, and it said, I'm going to the Golden Gate Bridge to jump. If one person smiles, I won't. He ended up jumping and dying. And we can only believe that if one person did smile at him or show that they cared, he may not have. So it's just to say, remember, if you are worried about people, please ask. Please check on them. If you see somebody in crisis, if you see somebody crying, don't walk past them. Give them a smile. And I think all of us in our lives have heard from somebody or have noticed, it's so simple when somebody just shows you a little bit of affection, just one little smile or one polite, and it can be a stranger, it can be somebody at the hotel, you know, that just smiles at you. It just makes you feel good. And I've had people tell me, you know, like a year later, like, hey, I remember when you did this and you showed that you cared, and that made a big difference. And I think we all have been there in our lives where we didn't even know we were making a difference for somebody, but we did. Okay, I'm gonna apologize. I screwed up this one, so it does this. I am not a guru with the computer. Okay, I'm through that. So I always knew and read that means restriction mattered. And actually, after watching Sarah Burns and Brandon Dryman do their YouTube video on suicide prevention through the IAFF, I was more inspired to include this in my presentation. Means restriction works. People, if their means of suicide are restricted, they will not find another means. It's been documented, it's proven, it works. But for first responders, we die by handguns. And there's absolutely no way we're going to get our first responders to give up their handguns. It's not going to happen. So that's why I just avoided this piece, because I didn't think that there was any point in putting value on it. But I figured out a loophole, so now I talk about it. So in the UK and in the US, they found when bridge barriers were erected, suicide rates in those areas dropped, and people didn't go to other bridges. Then in the UK, when they switched from coal gas to natural gas, which was less lethal, it was more difficult to die by carbon monoxide poisoning, suicide rates dropped. No increase in other ways. In Indonesia and Samoa, when the pesticides were made less toxic, again, suicide rates dropped. And then medication packaging in the UK, when they just reduced the amount of medication that you could get, they found that suicide rates dropped by overdose. And although people tried to overdose with ibuprofen, it's less lethal. So they saw that there wasn't that substitution. So then the question is, what can we do about handguns? So Australia, in 2006, after a mass shooting, they banned semi-automatic and automatic handguns. And the goal was mass shootings. It wasn't suicide. But they found suicide rates almost dropped by 50%. Suicide rates dropped dramatically. So that makes us question, how can we reduce our suicide rates by handgun? Because 95% of firefighters, according to the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance, die by handgun. And I'm sure law enforcement, it's probably 100%, because you guys all have them, and you know how to use them very well. So how can we reduce that? Well, I was reading some work done through the Veterans Association. And veterans are another population that will not give up their handguns. But there's a couple things we can do. First of all, we can know that more people die by suicide than both war and homicide combined. So statistically, you're more likely to die at your own hands than somebody breaking into your house. And if you're depressed and hopeless, you're even more likely to die by your own handgun. So when you get that through to somebody's head, they're going to be more willing to at least separate their means. So maybe they'll be willing to let you hold on to their gun for a few weeks until they can feel better. Because that's another thing. Suicidal crises are very intense, but they're very short-lived. They're not intense for long periods of time. They're very intense for short periods of time. But even if you can't get them to let you have their handgun for a few weeks, if you can talk to them about storing their ammunition in the basement, keeping their handgun, you know, somewhere else in a lockbox, putting a lock on their handgun, putting the handgun in another room, the ammunition in another room, and the key beside their bed. So they're not giving up their handgun, but now they have barriers. And what's been found is with these barriers, that gives that person time to realize that there are things worth living for. Because we all know when we're stressed, remember the prefrontal cortex goes like this. This part gets tunnel vision, right? And when you get into that tunnel vision, you can't rationalize and think very clearly. So if you can put methods in place and barriers in place, hopefully it gives time for this to come back down and rational decision making to come into place and to think about your family, to think about what's worth living, to realize that you don't want to die. And that is the saddest thing they found about people who died by suicide. Everybody who died by suicide wanted to live as strong as they wanted to die. People who die by suicide have a deep ambivalence. I had to look that word up too. It means competing thoughts. They have a deep ambivalence. The thoughts of survival and death are competing very strongly, and they're on a teeter-totter. And that's why one smile can push them towards life. One cross look can push them towards death. Extremely deep ambivalence. And they want to live just as much as they want to die. So if you give them a little bit of time, hopefully life wins over. Does that make sense? I always explain it differently, and I don't know if I make sense. It makes sense for me. So
That's where the impulse comes in. That is where it's impulse is.
yes, exactly.
It's the straw that broke the camel's back. It's that, and that's,
You're absolutely right. That's where the impulse comes in, but for the vulnerable person who has been hopeless and depressed. Exactly. That's where, and that's why people get a confusion and believe it's impulsive, and they forget that there was a trajectory that led them there. So department responsibilities, I think we're doing it here. First thing is collaborating with mental health professionals. Getting them in your police stations, your fire stations, letting your people get to know them, see that like this guy's a normal dude. I thought he was a firefighter. I didn't even realize he was a clinician. And that's what happens.
you don't work with it.
That's what happens when we don't know clinicians. We're kind of afraid of them. We think that they're going to ask us about our feelings and about the way we were raised, and they're going to be like super nosy. But then when you realize that they're normal humans and they actually know therapies that can make us feel better, that's huge. So collaborate with them. Get them in your firehouse. Let your people get to know them. Sometimes when that happens, the person that needs them the most is going to be the quietest and is going to like make like comments like, "Get this quack out of here." But I promise you, you're going to witness that person sneak outside and go talk to them right before they get in their car. It happens every time. So collaborating with mental health professionals and having that effective model is huge. Having as many resources, as many ways as possible will make a huge difference. Developing a peer support team, we're going to talk about that after the next break. Make sure that we include our retirees. Retirees are really powerful in that they're some of the best peer supporters we can have, because we're going to be more willing to tell retirees things that we are afraid to tell our coworkers who might tattletale or spread rumors. And then also, when you understand Dr. Joyner's theory about low belonging and not contributing, you understand how a retiree is at most risk, at the greatest risk over all of us. And then these are two very important pieces, and they're the two most difficult pieces. Luckily, we have a genius in the room who can help us figure out how to create policies. Point at you, Chief. We need to find a way, especially for law enforcement. This is the hardest piece for law enforcement, because law enforcement officers know that their guns will be taken away if they are not perfect. But we have to do two things. We have to have policies and procedures that encourage help-seeking behavior, that let people know if they willingly ask for help or get help, they're not going to be pulled offline, they're not going to be made fun of, that they can willingly ask for help. Because remember, our goal now is making a culture to where it's okay to ask for help. Because what's the alternative to asking for help? I heard it. Be loud. Suicide. Do you guys believe that? It's the alternative to asking for help. So we have to develop policies and procedures that encourage it and don't punish it. We have to make sure people know that they can get needed resources and continue to serve. That by asking for help and seeking treatment isn't going to make them go on a desk job unless they're absolutely out of their mind and they're doing stuff at work that, you know, necessitates pulling offline. And you guys understand that. But for the most part, people suffering, they are just perfect at work. If you knew a first responder who died by suicide, like a lot of us do, or somebody who died by suicide, it's very common to hear, I had no idea. I didn't notice anything. They were performing just fine at work, right? Do y'all agree? Yeah. So just know how important these two pieces are. These are critical. I talked about that. So peer support, it's puzzle. I know at my department, we were very hesitant to create a peer support team, and the reason for it was liability. What if? And then the other reason was, I don't have all the pieces, so we can't create the team until we have all the pieces in place. I'll tell you this, you'll never have all the pieces in place. It's not possible. If you can have trained individuals who are willing to learn about resources available and be a listening ear and help refer people to those resources, you have a peer support team. And so yeah, that's why I create this puzzle. So what does the bridge represent?
Between the person and mental health professional.
There it is. Yeah, the bridge is what the peer supporter is. It's just the connecting the person to mental health. I told you, genius. And then we have to include the white shirts. We have to include the white shirt, that's important. Chaplains, CISM. So peer support is not the same as CISM. It's not the same as a crisis intervention team. Two very different beasts. They can work together very well, but they're two very different things. Employee assistant programs, how many have great employee assistance programs? Some do, some don't. It's all about the administration figuring out how it works, and if it does work, and what works better or not. Some employee assistance programs, the resources for mental health aren't great, but the resources for financial help are fantastic, for legal help are fantastic. So it's just knowing what resources are the best.
Hey, Kat, can I just
Please.
make two quick comments
Please.
on that? So just two things. One, there's a brilliant fire chief in East Hartford, Connecticut, a guy named John Oates, and he started a peer support program in his department with zero money. But the key thing that he did was he did not allow individuals in his department to volunteer to be on the peer support team. He did not go out and solicit people in terms of popularity. What he did was he sent a one-question survey to his fire department. He said, if you were in crisis and you needed to speak to somebody in the fire department, and he excluded officers, so it was just rank and file members, he said, who would that person be? And he listed all of the members of the department. And they chose the top 10 individuals who the other members of the department would say that they would go to for help. And because those are the members who are most respected within your organization. So if you're thinking about starting a peer support program, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to John Oates, fire chief in East Hartford, Connecticut, brilliant guy, because individuals who express a desire to be a peer support person may in fact not necessarily be the ideal candidate. So just keep that in mind. The other thing that I just wanted to offer was just a huge thank you to the behavioral health professionals who are in the room, because one of the main challenges that I think we're facing with EAP programs is being referred to clinicians who know nothing about public safety. Like, you go to a clinician who deals with individuals whose biggest crisis in their life is that they have a child who's being disrespectful to them. And they try to apply the clinical, valid clinical procedures for us, and we're like, are you freaking kidding me? You're telling me to get more sleep. Like, I understand that that's important, but that's not the issue that we're dealing with. So just thanks to the behavioral health professionals in the room.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it is critical, because what I found, even like the great behavioral health professionals, a lot of them still believe, just like we do, that the overriding problem is the trauma of the job, and they forget that it's our problems at home. Because unfortunately, because of the job and the hours we work, we can have problems at home, and it can be the addiction to substances, it can be the financial issues that cause stress. So we have issues just like everybody else, and to always put the trauma on it keeps us from actually looking into those other issues. So we're gonna try to play a video. You think, yeah, we're good?
Well, we're gonna try.
So this video is awesome because it's only 3 minutes, and if you get it, you will leave here today as a trained peer supporter.
So what is empathy? And why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.